Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third week of cybersecurity seminar. Today, I'm very excited to introduce Solomon Sanya. Solomon is a computer science grad student here at Purdue University. He is actively working on cybersecurity tools, and he presents his research, leads workshops, and delivers keynote talks at cybersecurity conferences around the world, including talks in venues like DEF CON and Black Hat USA. Solomon, please take it.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me, especially letting me to be able to deliver a talk. Hopefully it goes well. I'll do my best to also monitor the chat. In case there are any questions, please chat away and I'll answer them as best as possible. Okay, so here are some things on what to expect in our conversation today. Do a little bit of background. We'll have a quick research motivation. We'll talk about the revolutions in malware affair, this concept that we use to understand how malware has evolved. And then we'll talk of how can we better secure our computer system? Like, what does this security mean for us in the future? And then we'll finish with some recommendations. I do have a disclaimer. The views that we present in this presentation, they're that of myself. They're me. They don't represent the views of the United States Department of Defense or the U.S. Air Force. Perfect. So who am I? Just real quick, from the background that you heard, I'm blessed to be a PhD student here. I've had previous positions in industry. This is actually my 15th year since graduating with my undergrad, and I worked in industry with cybersecurity in a very large organization for many years, including being the director of cyber operations training, as well as a computer science professor at the United States Air Force Academy. And so it was really good to do research and also to be able to teach. And then to now come here and work at Purdue, it's been an honor. I'm really happy to be here. Then other positions I've also done software reverse engineering. I also teach that every year in Rome, New York, and software development. And then, some education down there at the bottom. I like to learn things. All right, so real quick, research motivation. This is kind of the central thesis for this conversation. And I always, whenever I talk about cybersecurity, I always start with malware attacks. They continue to increase in sophistication and prevalence. I'm just using one simple metric, the CVEs, your common vulnerabilities and exposure, just as a zoomed out way of understanding, since the malware or exposures have been starting to be cataloged from like 1999, a little bit earlier than that, until here, I stopped this analysis in 2021. You can see that there's always been like a general climb in reporting of malware. So it's always increased and is always going to continue to increase. So looking at the evolution of malware, kind of want to, I introduced this at the beginning of our introduction, but I want to talk about this concept called a revolution in military affairs to understand like how has malware changed and evolved over time. So I'm starting with revolution in military affair. One definition of this is a fundamental change in the character and conduct of armed conflict. And so for me, I view like malware, reverse engineering malware, doing incident response. We're doing cyber warfare. We're constantly at battle and at war with malware authors who are writing malicious software in order to harm our enterprise or harm the organization that we care about. And so here, like, how do we understand like what fundamental changes have occurred? And that's why I'm using this definition. So with an RMA, these fundamental changes, it leads to an irrecoverable change in the conduct of warfare, or an irrecoverable change in the way that we do what we used to be doing, such that once we have this unique change, we forever use what we've learned or use something that's changed in the past, and then this becomes kind of like our way of life, or it becomes our modus operandi moving forward. Now, I have some examples real quick to kind of explain or, to pictographically represent a few RMAs in the past. So for one, kind of start with like the gunpowder, the advent of gunpowder, I believe by the Chinese hundreds of years ago. And so before we were using gunpowder, like warfare was conducted with stones and rocks and metal. You know, if I can craft a sword or any type of like weapon that I can use to conduct battle. This is kind of how both sides used to fight each other. And yes, we have large catapults, etc. But still, we did not have any mechanized like gun or weapon that we can call a gun until the gunpowder came. However, once we understood how to use and weaponize gunpowder, then we forever use gunpowder or some sort of munition and explosion to do many things in life, you know, including war, including missiles, bombs, etc. They're all going to stem from the advent of the gunpowder. Other RMAs can be included as like the hot air balloon, in which it gave an adversary the high ground. And generally, the person who has the high ground in a battlefield has the advantage to see where the enemy is advancing, as well as how to better combat, you know, the adversary, whoever we're going against. Other revolutions in military affairs, we can consider the creation of the airplane and flight, you know, mechanized flight as a revolution in which our life has forever irrecoverably been changed since we had the aircraft. We can go anywhere in the world now because of like mechanized flight, etc. The steam engine, like locomotive, being able to transport large, heavy things and long distances. You know, many of like our life has changed because of these. Another thing to talk about, as we discuss, even with munitions, would also be the rifling for being able to fire munitions. So before the creation of the rifling, being able to spiral an object like in a circular pattern. So before that, if I have a weapon, I'll even say like a musket or you know a precursor of our modern day gun. If I were to fire that, I put a metal object inside, I load it with gunpowder, and now I fire it at an adversary. I can hit an adversary with much greater force than I can use with my own, you know, my own might, but I was still highly inaccurate. And that's because in the muzzle that you have, when you put a weapon inside, it actually bounces around in the muzzle before it's ejected, and now it's in space, you know, going to hit a target. So even if I went to fire this way, because of how that muzzle or the weapon was bouncing, I can fire this way, and my munition would go this way or go that way. Highly, highly inaccurate until we created the rifle. So with that, I can now shoot a weapon and it will fire straight. So we gain accuracy as well as range with the rifling. And any munition that we fire since the creation of the rifle, it's always going to have some sort of rifling embedded inside. You know, it changed the character of how we did warfare. Other things to include, it would be like the integrated circuits, the computer, being able to launch systems from space. So this also allows us to have worldwide communication like GPS. You know, this has been a change. Like before we were using maps, you know, now we will always have some sort of GPS that we depend on at this time. And then even our internet, you know, these things can be considered as revolutions and how our lives have forever changed to the point that we always use these revolutions to continue forward. So with that concept in mind, I do want to talk about revolutions in malware and how it's evolved in order for us to understand these significant changes, and we can talk about how do we better secure our systems in the future. So I'm going to categorize the malware that we discussed kind of in four main bins. One would, you know, like your overarching is cyber warfare. It's kind of like the foundation of malware that we're going to talk about, and any type of use of, you know, malware or attacks across cyberspace, we're just going to lump those in as cyber war. Ransomware has been a significant change in the use of malware that's propagated across the world onto our systems. Internet of Things, also a concept to consider when we discuss malware and its evolution. And then finally, critical vulnerabilities, which systems have been compromised by it. So with that in mind, I would now like to go back to our count of significant malware events across time, and then let's see how those significant revolutions have occurred. And I'm going to go kind of quickly just with the interest of time, because you know, I used to teach, so you know, you give me time, I'm going to talk, and then I'll ask for more time. But I'll be as fast as possible. So one thing to start with, if we look at, you know, the I love you worm. So what we learned from like having this I love you worm. Yeah, there were a few others before then, and even we can even go back into like the 1980s, but I want to start here at 2000. So the I love you worm it was kind of like one of our first uses of internet worms and technology and sending like malicious content across many different systems, and it had a worldwide impact. This one was, I believe, our first multi-billion-dollar event due to a malware that was sent from one machine and attacked, millions and millions of machines. It's recorded that the I Love You worm had I think the FBI or so, they recorded that this had a $5.5 billion tag in damages because of this worm and how it was able to spread. Since then, we learned, now we're authors, now we're writers, we've learned that I can now send, instead of just trying to attack a single system, I can find vulnerabilities and have my malware worm itself across the internet. Moving over to 2005, we have the Sony rootkit. So Sony actually installed, it was like our DRM, like copyright protection media on its machines in order for us to verify we're only listening and sending like copyright media that we purchased and owned. But the way that they were able to embed their software on their machines, malware authors alike, we learned, aha, there's this even better concept called rootkits. And so if in only, like instead of only writing my software to run at user level, I can figure out how to borrow to have root level privileges and then to be able to run multiple software toolkits with root level privileges. Now, if we look at the Archivist malware, so the Archivist malware, this kind of was one of our first uses of ransomware that now had asymmetric encryption. Before this Archivist was released and we learned about it, when ransomware was like sent from one machine to many other machines, yes, ransomware was not new by 2005, but usually there was a symmetric key that was used to encrypt and decrypt the machines. So if one person paid the ransom, or if we reverse engineered and figured out like this is the key used to lock and to unlock the machine, I can now send that key to everybody else, and now we can kind of like mitigate the causes or the impacts of ransomware up to this time. But Archivist using RSA, this is now an asymmetric encryption, which made it very difficult to crack unless we actually had like some information on how it was used to secure or to encrypt details on the machine to begin with. The Zeus botnet. So when we look at Zeus, like it was very, very nice as a widespread toolkit that many people can take and then adapt and use for their own needs. But something else that Zeus kind of like changed our warfare was that it specifically focused on banking Trojans, or excuse me, on exploiting banking websites as well as keyloggers. So with the keylogger, I can see where you're accessing the internet. I see what you're typing in, your username, your password, especially to various websites. And now we can exchange, like, how do we exploit and gain like greater money from looking at what the users are doing? Okay, I'm going to move a little faster. So in 2007, so we had a lovely attack. I mean, lovely to learn from now, but at the time it was not for Estonia, in which we all know, or many people have heard as the Estonia, like the distributed denial of service, in which cyber machines were used to cause like millions and millions of dollars to an entire country. So this is one of our first weaponization of cyber impacting a nation state as Estonia. It was very big, but from then, like a lot of organizations really started to consider, well, what does it really mean to be attacked with a distributed denial of service? And then how do we mitigate this? How do we have redundancies in order to keep from going down as terribly as Estonia was attacked by some disgruntled individuals? In 2008, so this is Configure. So 2008, that was like the bane of my existence, because this is after I graduated with my undergrad and I'm working in industry. Configure was one of the biggest things that we had to respond to every single day, 24/7, with machines being infected with this type of worm that we don't really know what it was going to do or what it was about. But the significant thing that we learned from Configure, although it wasn't the first to implement this, but it was one of the first widespread uses of DGA. So DGA stands for Domain Generating Algorithm, in which if a malware or worm wants to establish command and control, or at least to be able to send either exfiltrate or infiltrate information to a system, you would, like reversing the malware, you would generally have an idea on how to extract all of the domains that this malware might be able to communicate with. So that means if I can understand all like a huge list of domains that a malware is going to communicate with, then I can now set rules in place. I can block access to these websites. I can also like set up like monitors or alerts such that if I see any machine across our enterprise reaching out to these known malicious domains, then I have a potential infection. Now let me go after this machine. But with Configure, with a domain generating algorithm, this means there are keys and seeds used to generate the actual domains that's going to be used to exfiltrate or to communicate with the command and control server. However, if I had two machines that were compromised with the same configure worm, one machine may generate 50,000 or 500,000 unique domains it may try and communicate with. The next machine, two machines, the next one may generate its own list of multiple hundred of thousands of domains that it might try and reach and communicate with, even though in real life, like the real domains were maybe, let's say 50 or 60 active domains, but with an algorithm, it made it very difficult in order to know where this malware is going to reach out to, as well as it made it hard to find, like, might it reach out in the future? How do we detect? How do we alert, etc.? But the unique thing to learn is since we understood DGAs, now most of the malware that I interacted with that usually establishes command and control almost always had some sort of domain generation sequence inside, which just made it harder to detect and defeat. Stuxnet, I think most of us in cybersecurity, many of us have heard about Stuxnet. Now, what we learned from Stuxnet, really, really well written, very well written malware and worm that made its way across the internet until it got on specific programmable logic controllers inside Iran. But inside this, our first major use in where we see kinetic effects from cyber. And so I don't have time to talk about everything that it did. You know, there are many good quick YouTube videos that we can see the effect of Stuxnet on its specific targets. Very well written, as I mentioned multiple times. But we really saw how like I can write software and then cause like serious kinetic effects from one specific worm or software that we can write. Moving over into 2013. So 2013, there's CryptoLocker. I don't have time to talk about that one, but APTs. So APT1 was released by Mandiant, the very, very well-known security company, Mandiant. So in 2013, this was the first release, like the first known release from a civilian organization that actually had multiple years of investigating well-known threat actors across the world. And so in APT1, they identified, the specific country as having long-term impacts and hands and reaching and kind of like monitoring exfiltration of information from many companies around the world. And I mentioned it lasted for multiple years and also exploited the X.509 certificates. So where we thought we were having secure communication, the specific country that's listed in APT1, they were able to read everything that an organization was using for years. And so this was a good, it was an eye opener of, wow, there are nation states that are weaponized to like attack, exfiltrate, infiltrate information from specific organizations and companies. Yep. Now, looking at shell shock, and so if we look at 2014, and I need to move faster. So if we look at 2014, so there were good attacks with Heartbleed as well. Previously mentioned with APT1, we're talking about like certificates and exfiltrating like secure communication and being able to read that. Other attacks have stemmed from that. So I won't talk about the Heartbleed, which is a really good attack, but at least shell shock. So in shell shock, when we learned this in 2014, this shell shock attack, it was a vulnerability in Linux machines that actually extended since like 1989. So very many years of kind of having a time sequence attack on what we thought was a secured operating system, secured machines. This was really nice. Many malware authors have adopted a type of how can I like exfiltrate like time sequencing in order to escalate my privileges onto specific machines. But we also had like large known, like really well known of the insider threat. I think that word um, was not commercialized, but in the civilian sector, we really started to look at like, wow, what really does the insider threat look like when Snowden went out and released lots of information, from a specific agency, had really large impacts, but it also um, kind of raised awareness of what large government might be able to do against individuals. But at least the insider threat was an important concept that we really started looking at since 2014. If I move forward, so ransomware as a service, we started to see that in 2016. As I mentioned, ransomware was not new, but actually being able to lease your ransomware and have it work in effect for a specific time against specific targets, and then to lease that and give that access to many other individuals. We started to see that from 2016. And now most of ransomware that we see usually implements some sort of ransomware as a service that we first started to see since 2016. Okay, let me talk about real quick in 2020, and then we'll finish in 2021. So in 2020, we saw the SolarWinds. So SolarWinds, large organization that many other corporations kind of lease services and protections from, but SolarWinds was a really powerful supply chain interdiction type of attack. In which you have trusted organizations, let's even go with a government that leased many of the tools from SolarWinds. Now, the entities did not attack the government. They did not exploit like many protected government networks, but instead they exploited like verified or authorized software that's now used inside organizations. So here we are, we purchased services from SolarWinds. SolarWinds had many products, including the Orion software, the Orion software suite, that was now compromised from the code. Where it was coded, now individuals at the SolarWinds company did not know that their code was compromised. They compromised malicious code over to other protected organizations. And now many people were exploited and are still dealing with how to remediate the effects from SolarWinds. So at least we understand, like, instead of me as the attacker trying to exploit the organization directly, I can utilize an indirect attack to go after the software that's used or your supply chain to allow that attack to come into the protected organization, which is really nice. So the Colonial Pipeline, I think I'll stop with this one. The Colonial Pipeline in 2021. So this was also really well-known ransomware, but many significant things happened because of this Colonial pipeline. In the U.S., many people, across the northeast side of the nation, were running because we thought like there'll be a fuel shortage because the companies not really know how much fuel was in there and within their pipeline, et cetera. So it caused damage. Like many millions of dollars were lost as a result. But the United States actually changed like the way it cared about ransomware because of this. And I'll talk about that in one of our slides to come. Now, here's just the thought process. When we talk of, I always say ransomware and malware is continuing to increase in sophistication and prevalence. In the back of our minds, we always think that, hey, our software security is always getting better. I thought we are getting better. And that is true. Software security is getting better at protecting against ransomware and malware. You'll see Apple saying, hey, we're really good. We detect, almost all of our 0 days, our phones are secure. Android will try and do the same thing. Your different operating systems will come and say, we're very secure. We're very secure. We have the AI to protect us. But, I just want us to beware that it seems we are crossing paths between what our security vendors will tell us, and actually what's happening in real life. So here's a report by RAND. It was called 0 Days, Thousands of Nights. This report is quite a few years old now, but at the time, it actually identified that many 0 days are actually the average lifespan of 0 day can last multiple years. And so what they looked at, it was like half of all the 0 days that they looked at, it had an average life expectancy of 6.9, almost 7 years in existence. Now, your antivirus companies, many of them will say, hey, we detect so many 0 days so quickly. As I mentioned, we have insert security platform and tool here, just to make us feel more secure. But in reality, many of these 0 days are lasting for a very, very long time. So software is getting better, but the malware authors are also advancing and are also increasing. So we should never truly have this full sense of my computer, my systems are secure when many malware will always persist. And then unfortunately, whenever we finally detect, oh, here's a new malware, unfortunately, that malware has been in your network, in your organization, for many, many, many years. One other thing to talk about when we started with APT1 2013, 2014, it was mainly 2013 by Mendian. Since then, there have been lots of advanced persistent threats identifying specific nation states and like specific hacker actors or hacker groups. And then they usually talk of how do they exploit systems? What are they generally looking for? What's their modus operandi? And what are some specific signatures from these organizations? This number has always been increasing since 2013. Since 2021, 2022, we're at over 40 APTs. Right now, I'm sure it's a few more than that. But again, you will always have actors that are out there exploiting your machines. And so us, as we consider software security and our network security, enterprise security, we should always think in the back of our minds, how might our systems become exploited? And then what should we do? How do we better detect this and defend our systems moving forward? Here are some things that I added in order to kind of help us view the awareness of malware. So, and like threat actors, the evolution of malicious software, etc. So every year, many reputable organizations release their it's usually an annual report, annual cyber report, annual malware report, in which they talk of from the last year until now, so many hundreds of thousands, almost millions new malware samples have been detected, and these have been successful. And then you generally see specific trends in malware. Since we looked at these reports from like 10, 15 years ago, it was generally what malware is trying to do on your specific system, how to compromise and own your computer, how to shut it down, kind of doing some sort of DOS activity until your general trends that you almost always see now since like the last 7, 8 years is how is ransomware changing? How is it holding your resources ransom and hostage until you pay a fee? And then we see every year organizations are actually paying like upwards of billions of dollars in ransoms in order to try and gain access to their computer systems. I forgot the college, but it was recent. There was a college in California. It was less than 3 years ago that the ransomware, like the cost to remediate the ransomware from all of their computer systems was so great that the actual college had to shut down. I'm not lying. I wish I can recall that. I wish I put it into the slide. I didn't remember the university, but I'll try and find that after this talk. So we all can see it. But yeah, it's a significant cost that we do have to understand, and how do we better protect our system. So overall, the main point I'd like us to leave here is we should really adjust our view of the world. And that view of the world includes the knowledge that every device is an attack surface for a malicious individual in order to exploit our computer systems and exploit our enterprises. So IoT, Internet of Things, a new cyber attack platform. I spoke about Stuxnet earlier, but when was the last time that really you thought, this advanced technology that I have in my car, in my vehicle, this technology may be spying on me, or this technology may be trying to kill me because of malware that either existed at the time from the manufacturers, or malware was able to be injected into that car, into this technology that I'm using, because lots of these vehicles have a connection stream either to the real internet or to their base manufacturers in order for diagnostics or to learn, or whenever you receive updates onto your computer systems, it's important to know that malware can be injected that can now harm and kill you. To the top right, I also have like kind of your smart devices, like your smart light bulbs. I love to have things. I can just monitor and control these items from my phone, but really lots of these devices have almost zero security embedded within them. There are times when I was asked to exploit computer machines, like to do penetration testing or to understand like what could be the vulnerabilities in the organization. Besides going after the user to exploit, I would also look at these devices that could be present because many times these have good exploitation attack points for me to come from your light bulb to exploit your computer machines. It's just something to be cognizant and to know about. Another thing, I think there was a thank you for the note, John. There was another uh, lawsuit from Ring, I believe Ring slash Amazon, which I believe Amazon took over Ring, but it was a few years ago in which the Ring networks were compromised by malware or compromised with malware by malicious actors. And now the actors were able to use these devices like inside the homes in order to spy on the people that are present within the house. They're also able to like talk, and have like malicious voices. I am watching you. Some people were able to do this from these devices. There's like a lawsuit that I believe Ring lost because they knew some of their devices were unsecure. Their devices were not secure, and then individuals were able to compromise them. I have like your stoplights and other like Internet of Things that we rely on, these could be compromised with malware, like the Mariah botnet. That was one of our first uses of Internet of Things malware. So as I keep saying, the automation that we bring into our house, can be a very low-hanging fruit for malicious actors to attack your network. So just be cognizant and, think if this system is going to attack my network, how can I better secure my system? Usually isolation and segregation or segmentation is one of the best approaches for those. Now, the airplane attack of the 737 Maxes, when the first one crashed, and then when the second one crashed, the actual first thing that I was thinking about, I usually don't go to, well, was the pilot malicious? Did the pilot have a mistake? And that led to the crashing of the systems. But these crashes occurred because of software. Now, could a malicious actor have embedded malicious code to take over the airplane and to cause it to crash? These are true things that could actually happen. There is another, I didn't include it here, but there was another individual that was actually kicked off. I believe it was a United aircraft. You can Google it and find like it was a hacker, well-known hacker. He was, according to the report and some of the news, he was able to exploit the entertainment system inside the airplane and was able to view some of the actions from the actual instruments in the cockpit. So according to him, he said he was able to do some things in the airplane, and then like either tweeted about it or let the world know that, hey, I've actually exploited the entertainment system in the airplane, and now he was kicked off of a flight, I think banned from United or something like that. But these are true vulnerabilities that could exist if we don't think about these from inception and then figure out how do we better secure the system. There's also like medical devices that are placed inside individuals to help our lives, like pacemakers or insulin pumps that are controlled and they can be modified using a computer, as cyber linkage to, like see how is the individual, how is the patient responding to treatment, how do we adjust how it's working. But these two represent a significant attack surface that a malicious actor could use to harm individuals. It's just another way of cyber warfare that could exist. And then the last one, Charlie Miller and Chris Valsek, I want to say it was around 2013, 2014, but they became like very famous on being able to like figure out how to inject code into vehicles to cause the vehicles to do malicious things. There are also a few thanks, Mike. There are also a few YouTube videos that show like some of the impacts that they were able to have. But in one, they attacked like the whole Jeep GM network. Another one, I also think they were driving like a Prius. So they rip up the dashboard, they understand what are the embedded devices to inject code, and then you can see while one individual is driving, the other person was able to inject code to like jerk on their seatbelt. They were also able to like cause the steering wheel to shift or to change. So imagine if a malicious actor has malware just embedded and waiting inside many, many vehicles, they now want to do harm while you're going at 60, 70 miles per hour on the freeway. Now they jerk the wheel. This can cause significant harm and damage to individuals that we really need to be cognizant of these attack services and then starts to ask the question, how do we persist and how do we keep, an adversary from exploiting our computer systems? So if we look at approaching security, there are two main levels that we'll discuss. One, approaching security at the national level, and then approaching security at the individual level. At the national level, we have these things. We have various task forces that are established, in the Department of Defense with Department of Homeland Security, usually the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, NSA, as well as the United States, U.S. Cybercom. But these individuals got together, especially, I think this one was led by the FBI, as well as from the president. But after the 2021 Colonial Pipeline, this kind of brought like our nation, the U.S., to really say that, okay, ransomware is a serious attack. It's a serious cyber warfare that we really have to deal with. So how do we respond? And then the ransomware task force was created as a result of this, in which they said that ransomware attacks present an urgent national security risk around the world. And so after having this task force and multiple task forces since then, but they came, when this one was established, they came up with four main recommendations. One, establishing an international coalition to combat ransomware. How do we disrupt ransomware with businesses and disrupt a profit model such that we can try and just elevate the way that attackers are able to receive funds from that, so hopefully we can make it less profitable for malicious entities. How do we establish ways to help organizations to prepare and to respond with ransomware attacks? And then, as I mentioned, the response. And so they also said we need an international cooperation and adoption process of standards and expectations that are actually still in use to this day. And so from the nation, like we try and see how do we share information in order to reduce ransomware from attacking our systems, especially from now and through the future. So this is just a model just from 1 year that they said from 2020 to 2021, that over 2,400 US-based governments, healthcare facilities, et cetera, they were victim of ransomware attack. On average, the victims paid in 2020 over $350 million due to ransomware. And so there is advanced skill sets used to create ransomware. This is true, but in the scheme of things, it doesn't cost millions of dollars to create. So imagine it's extremely profitable for malicious actors to create ransomware and now to receive fees, which is why I say our world, we are never getting away with ransomware because it's just so profitable for us. Now, or profitable for the malicious actors. I wear both hats, so I'm just saying it's profitable for the malicious actors. Now, how do we approach security on the individual level? Well, I want to introduce this concept called the Byzantine generals problem and then Byzantine fault. So in computer science, this is a well-known concept in which we deal with distributed systems or distributed computing. So the Byzantine generals problem, it deals with you have multiple entities out there. And so with multiple systems that are communicating, we want to be able to identify when one of the systems fails, either intentionally or maliciously. Now it's acting in ways that it was not supposed to act. So how do we detect and then how do we respond to this? As I mentioned, it's well known, but I'm running out of time. I still have many things to talk about, so I can't talk too much on this slide, but I'm going to explain it a bit more in the following slides. So Byzantine fault tolerance, as I mentioned. So everyone, when you talk of the Chinese Byzantine, just the Byzantine problem, since you have many actors that all must work in unison. So when they work in unison, it's called a consensus. In case any one of our systems fail, it's called a fault. So how do we respond and keep our systems as resilient as possible? Well, the easiest way, or one way to start with whatever system that we own, you actually have that system that we wish to protect, and you draw a circle around it. Then we look at the components and the dependencies required in order for that system or that software or this framework to work. What are the dependencies and the components that need to run? Then we ask ourselves which failures in any one of these components can lead to the compromise of the overall integrity of this system or this software or this machine that we need to protect. And then we go about how do we protect and respond against these systems. So one way, as I mentioned, if we look at the computer system, I kind of drew our stack in which we have applications below your applications that run and user programs that run. We have libraries and routines and then system calls that run in order to help those applications like operate as needed by the user. Then below those routines and system calls, we have the operating system that's calling and interacting with that. Below your operating system, you have the kernel level and firmware and your hardware abstraction layer in order to help like kind of interact with our hardware and different components that are attached to the system. So once we have the overall computer machine that we want to protect, as always, we ask ourselves which failures can compromise the integrity of the system. So I spoke about when we look at the computer system at the beginning of malware and like the evolution of malware, we usually started at the user program level because that's what we knew how to compromise and exploit. Until later on, we learned, like even from our rootkits, et cetera, oh, I can compromise library routines and system calls that gives us better privilege, exploitation, and execution on the system until we can exploit the operating system itself. And so if we can exploit the operating system, then that means any software that's run on the operating system, like if I have AV that's only run at user level with user privileges, and yet I have hardware that's embedded in the operating system or hardware that comes already installed on the firmware or the components that are used to operate the system, this software cannot stop my malware that's running down here because I'm already at a more privileged level on making the overall system run. And the same thing with the hardware. And so us, as security professionals, we should ask ourselves and see, like, how do we secure our critical data and our processes, even when every layer of the computer system is compromised already? And then the last thing, as I mentioned, in previous attacks that I've been commissioned to help and find exploits and vulnerabilities into networks, anytime, and this will always be my go-to, even moving forward. Anytime I'm asked, what vulnerabilities persist on an organization, or if I'm in an organization, they say, hey, how can we be attacked? Instead of looking at, okay, let's look at your software, let's look at your computers, what do you buy, who do you communicate with? The first thing I go to is, very good, who are your users here? Because if I can understand how to exploit the users, then I can allow the users to carry me into your network and then exploit everything else from there. And so I have a quote here at the bottom, amateurs attack systems, but experts attack the people. Because usually the user, like that's the softest, that's the easiest way to allow them to bring me onto a network, and then I can pivot from that. And at the bottom, I just have like well-known attackers. And again, you can find these on YouTube, like Relic, Dave Kennedy, or Jason Eastreet on like really, really good social engineers. And then they actually have live attacks on where they're able to exploit computer systems and exploit people. And then that allowed them to exploit entire enterprises. And so hopefully the links, like when you get this, the links can appear, and then you can actually go to and see how the video and how they exploited the machines. All right, so the Byzantine failure approach. Overall, we have to be able to evaluate our system, evaluate your entire stack, and then see if any one of these failures can occur. How does it compromise our systems? And then more importantly, we have to understand, like, approach security from the system that I'm using is already compromised. Okay, the system is compromised. How do we still assure our critical information and our critical processes? What can we do to still secure like our operation as an organization? Because failure to do this, as I mentioned, this costs billions. It's measured in billions of dollars a year because we did not better secure our systems. So overall, recommendations, and I think we're getting towards the end, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions. But at least the recommendations for a more secure tomorrow, I want to leave us with these 4 main tenets. And that's dealing with zero trust. How do we approach our systems from a mission assurance process or an information assurance standpoint? How do we approach security from the educational standpoint? And then how do we approach security from a cultural standpoint? Your work or your organization culture, how do we change that in order to better secure our computer systems? So the first, incorporate zero trust. So when we talk about zero trust, we kind of assume that, one system, if we have 2 entities that need to communicate on a network, the second entity should not trust the first one until you validate the information they should have access to. Then you validate that truly they should have access to this data, and then you kind of monitor or you have guards on how do they access, and then what are they doing to hopefully identify anomalies to the system. So we start by inventorying all of our assets, know what's on the network, catalog your approved and unauthorized software and devices, and access mechanisms. This goes towards the exposure that exists inside the organization. And then we look towards endpoint protection. We should never get away from those. I bash on our AV vendors because I write exploits, and so usually like the exploits that I would write, it takes time, but it's usually never detected by the AV vendor at first. Yeah, there was even a software like I actually released this one. There was even like a botnet that I created, or a remote administration tool. But anyway, a botnet I released in like 2014, was it? 2014, I think. And so initially when I wrote it, of course, I actually uploaded it to AV vendors. I uploaded it to VirusTotal to see, okay, how are you going to detect me? Because this truly was malicious, zero detections. Now, fast forward years later, I released it in 2014, so it was written in 2012, 2013. Years later, like 2016, I remember I got a notification on one of my computer systems that I was compromised with a malware. It's like, I have a malware on my machine, like that I don't know about. Okay, interesting. How did someone compromise my system? I was intrigued. I was like, man, how did you get inside? So I looked at the AV vendor, like reputable AV vendor. I looked at the report, and then it referenced the first version of the malware that I released over 2 years ago at that standpoint. Not even newer versions. It actually detected the first version that was sitting on my machine. So again, it's not non-trivial in order for me to know how to like evade detection from our AV vendors, etc. So we still need these, but that alone is not enough. So here we also look at access control. Always change your default credentials. You control and validate now your ingress and egress points. How does information get into my network? How does it leave my network? And then, very important on organizations, how do you detect your lateral movement? And so that means once I'm inside an organization, how do I see how computer machines are talking to other computer machines? Because this is generally like our best way, to exploit other computers once we're inside an organization. It's like your hard outer shell, but inside lateral movement has been difficult to detect, but we need to be cognizant of those. Okay, in the interest of time, I put other things, here to consider, but analytics and then monitoring. So if your organization does not have means, or your future organization doesn't have the resources to invest in like really monitoring and protecting your systems and your network, we can invest into like cloud security operations centers in order to kind of outsource, in a secured mechanism, outsource like monitoring of your systems to experts, usually at a cheaper cost, hopefully. But if you cannot afford that in your organization, at least there are others who can. And so this is something, to consider in order to increase security of your enterprise. Then the next one, redesign our entire security posture to one of mission assurance. And so I say, we should already approach security saying, my machine is already compromised. All right. How do I protect our organization still? How do we protect, what is our IP, our intellectual property? How do we detect these things? And then generally, if we can ask ourselves, if ransomware, whatever attack, data theft, loss, contamination, non-availability, if these attacks hit our network and our systems, how does our organization, how do our systems prevent the attack? How does it detect the attack? How does it respond to the attack, recover, and then how do we persist in order to keep our organization running even in spite of the attack that's currently ongoing? And some things we can ask ourselves is, what is our reaction time? Is this acceptable? Is this too slow? How do we enhance this? We should also always look at our dependencies, like SolarWinds. SolarWinds, the organization was trusted. We bought software from this organization, but what about if software from our dependency is compromised, or even our point of sale that impacted like Chase Bank, as I mentioned, JP Morgan, Home Depot, etc. I think, anyway, if you have like different types of attacks from our dependencies, how do we secure our systems moving forward? And then we also look at what about our communication devices, just as our mobile phones. Also, man, I wish I had time to talk about mobile phones, but I tell you, that's even one of our second easiest mechanisms to exploit networks. I'm just going to come in from your phone because you're going to download that nice Candy Crush or that nice application or that nice game that's free, but I'm going to have malware embedded inside in order to pivot to your other machines once you allow me onto the network. So, just consider, this device is attacking me. How do I detect that? How do I respond from that? And then also the malicious insider. Can you determine if we should always think of that malicious insider, inside the network. Now, if they do have access to our information, how do we know, like, what is their footprint? What can they touch? And then how do we automate? How do you automate, like, how to identify the risk and then to mitigate the damage? These are things we should think about from an enterprise. I think I'm running out of time, but our overall culture, so we do need to enhance our culture. Like, how do we know that it's acceptable for the right people to red team our systems and our processes and our policies, and then embrace, like, finding your vulnerabilities and then remediate the vulnerabilities? That's okay. Always red team your system. And then user education. How do you enhance this annually and just maintain that awareness? Everybody should be aware, but don't have that boring training that says, attackers can come in this way. Make it useful, make it something that the person understands safety, and then they work towards enhancing this in the overall organization. And then lastly, education. So education is very important. And here, from an education academia, it's good to incorporate, like, these types of talks. This is perfect. How do you learn from other people who have been dealing with this in the past? How do we research and partner and establish those collaborations with national cyber task forces, institute like your NISTs of the world, your Department of Homeland Security, US Cybercom? They love collaboration, and they actually have, like, weekly meetings that, organizations can join, for free, just to learn how do we enhance our security. So these are things I'll definitely recommend, incorporate those lessons learned into academia, and even us, because I used to teach, I will be going back into teaching once I'm finished here at Purdue. But how do we implement, like, safe coding paradigms in our teaching? So whenever I teach a student, here's how you code a project, I should also talk about security, so that our software developers are not going out there not aware of vulnerabilities that somebody else could exploit. We need to talk about this. Security should always be built in, from inception, and not bolted on after things have been released. And then, validate code. Validate code in our code repositories, so you can prevent things like our solar winds in your supply chain exploitation. Okay, so that's all. I am out of time, but if there is any time for questions, I can hang out to answer any of those. Thank you again for your time, Serious Mike, and everybody here at Purdue. Thank you so much. Hope it was useful, and I'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great talk. We have one question in the question and answer.
Got it. Okay, I'm trying to pull that one up. Yeah, if you can read it for me. Sorry, I can't.
Yeah. What is the best method to protect a small-scale network, size of a home lab? Are frequent updates plus intrusion prevention, like fail-to-ban, a better choice than antivirus software? I think that's a multiple part question. Let's go through this, and then we'll reach to the other half.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. So that's definitely a really good question. So if you look at, like, your small scale networks, like a home lab or so, as I mentioned, we should always consider that, that TV that you have that's on the network, that Netflix that you love to watch, etc., that TV could be attacking you. So, in my network, I am a strong proponent of that segmentation. And so in my same network, I have, like, a firewall and different appliances that I purchased, that I actually segment off, like, different devices that can communicate on my network. So that means my TVs, my smart devices, whatever we're using, your home security system, all of those, it's on its own network. And that's because, like, unclassified TVs could be, different devices could come with malware embedded on it. And so I already think that, hey, this thing is attacking me. So how do I just limit, like, the exposure of my systems? How do I limit the exposure of, like, what's important to me? My systems that I'm running on, that I'm writing code on, that I'm researching, the system that I check my bank account, or all those things. I try and keep them as separate as possible from, the TV or the printer that could be sniffing my network and actually learning everything that I'm doing. Something else that I utilize is definitely virtual machines. And so, like, you can get virtual machines for free. In fact, I think I just saw a report this week. It was either this week or last week, very, very recent, that I believe Microsoft has released like a free virtual machine for Windows 11. And you can run these on like VirtualBox. VirtualBox is free. It's a good hypervisor that now I can launch like multiple images like operating systems on. And so I would get these, and then like me, if I'm going to check my bank account, my most protected things, or add something to my social security number, that's in its own virtual machine. If I'm searching the internet, doing research for academia, etc., that's on its own virtual machine. I don't check Facebook anymore, but when I used to check Facebook, it was many years ago, I had a virtual machine just for Facebook. Because like there was quite a while ago that like good malware was being propagated even from those networks. And so I would just say like the vigilance of like reducing the exposure of what is most important in your home, in your small network. I'm really a proponent of those. And then you always keep your defense in depth mechanisms. You always keep your computer up to date. You never run as like the root or your system administrator on your computer. So yes, it's easy to do that. If I want to install software, I want to just be able to install and move on. But me, whenever I install my computer, my operating system, I create a limited user, and then anytime I log into my machine or whatever I'm doing, I'm operating as my limited user. So in case I do have a compromise, hopefully it's not able to easily have root level access. And then whenever I need to do a privileged operation, you enter your password, you do that, and then you go back to your limited user. So those are type of like just simple ways to be a little more vigilant to reduce exposure to your network.
Well, thanks so much for the complete answer. The second part, I think you already answered. It was, does utilizing virtualization, isolated VMs or containers make a big difference? And
Yes. Yep.
we have another two more questions. If I want to do national security in the future, where should I start and what skills should I focus on learning?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's a very, very large that's a very large question. I won't be able to answer that fully, but this is one of the things I would suggest. And so if we do want to understand security and work wherever we want to work to be able to help our organization, where do we start? Well, the first thing I would actually say is what is your niche? Like what are you most interested in? And so with that, like if you were like looking at like network traffic or network package, like Wireshark or so, then really I'll just focus on like, hey, how do I get better at like incident response? How do I get better at looking and monitoring the network? If you Google, there used to be a really good operating system. It was called Security Onion by Doug Burks. And then I believe that was either bought by Mandiant or FireEye. I think they're the same company now. But there are some YouTube videos of like Security Onion. And so with that, like using this operating system, you can actually see like how do I better defend, detect, and secure overall computer networks, and across the board. In security overall, if we learn, like there are a few books on penetration testing, so that could be another like easy way in. Kali Linux, and yeah, you can Google like Kali Linux, how do I exploit and defend using this Kali Linux operating system. It used to be called Backtrack. But with this Kali Linux, it's like an operating system with penetration testing tools and defensive tools, but mainly penetration testing tools built in. Now I can Google, how do I use Kali Linux? How do I learn? How do I exploit systems? Another main tool that you would see on Kali Linux is like Metasploit or yeah, it's like Metasploit. And Armitage used to be a lovely tool. Anyway, and we talk about Metasploit. You can see how do I use this tool, and then like how can I launch this tool against my system that I want to protect? And then how do I learn like what does an attack actually look like? There are other certifications that you could look into. I'm usually not a person that like really says go after certifications because we're in an academic environment here. So if we do our studies, if we look at YouTube and exploitation, we can also learn how to defend. I think I mentioned there's a decent book on as like penetration testing with Kali Linux or Kali Linux penetration testing. There's a newer version that was just released in 2023, I believe. But if you purchase this book, you can also find it online. But if you look towards these, there are many different concepts that are embedded inside. If you learn, just browse. You don't have to learn everything, but if you browse, you see what's interesting. You can now study it more in depth in that manner. I think that's a good way to learn
I think we're running out of time. Maybe one more question, pretty quick in 1 minute. How has your malware work been impacted by recent advances in AI, ML, GitHub Copilot, or ChatGPT, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm trying to think of, so in essence, with these AI systems like ChatGPT or using some sort of GPT or even Google's Bard or so, how has my malware been impacted? I'll actually say my work has gotten a lot better and a lot easier on specific coding that I would want to write. And so before, like I'd actually have to like really, really study, how do I get code to do this in this language, and lots of Google, lots of Stack Overflow. But now kind of, if I go to these and I ask the right question, like with your different types of prompts that I send, I can actually see code that's more useful in order to help me like either exploit, evades detection, kind of like some sort of cryptographic function, etc. So I would actually see that these have helped me, and they've also helped the attackers. And if when we go towards defense, I believe that these will be better to detect like defensive attacks in the future. But I wouldn't, I'm against someone saying I have the AI. AI is going to better secure me. Like I don't think so, because the same people who have AI to defend, your attackers also have AI to learn what is detectable and then to figure out how do I write better exploits. So it's always a cat and mouse game. I think it helps the attackers more. And I think the last thing real quick, I saw a report on like the different packages and malware that's been released. In fact, I think I think Courtney's brief or his presentation last semester, he was talking about like the use of new packages and maybe the new malware that increased. And then you see like a scale here, and then like a sharp jump once like our chat GPT came online. And that's because authors of malware, they're learning, hey, instead of like having to write and spend so much time figuring out how to exploit, I can just go to this, ask the right question, I can see code that I can use to implement new malware. And so, it's good to defend, but it's much better to me so far to exploit. So it just makes me more efficient overall.
Okay, thank you so much. We have one more question, but I suggest that you reach out to the speaker or email and ask your question if you're interested. So thank you so much for the great talk and great question and answer session.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Solomon. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
again.
Take care.